Today's homily is going to be a kind of a request homily again. Frequently I'll get requests from somebody in the community to address a particular topic in a homily. And so a few weeks ago, Jerry Szymanski's brother David died. And Jerry asked me if I would do a homily on brothers. So that's what I'm going to speak to this morning, homily on brothers. So I picked out a reading which shows Jesus in an interaction with his own brothers from the Gospel of Mark. And just to remind you that it's the third Sunday of the month, so it'll be an extended homily question-answer discussion at the end. So keep your thinking caps on. This is taken from the very beginning of Jesus' public ministry. Do you want to stand for the gospel? Then Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, "He's out of his mind." Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they told him, "Your mother and your brothers are outside looking for you." "Who are my mother and my brothers?" he asked. Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is brother and sister and mother to me." Words inspired by God. Over the last several months, I've devoted many homilies to looking at, recognizing, honoring, and celebrating the feminine face of God, because it needed to be alluded to. Today, I want to look at the other side of the equation and look at, if you want to call it, the masculine face of God. There are metaphors anywhere, because God obviously doesn't have gender, but we experience God in many different ways, and we need to experience God in the feminine way and in the masculine way. So I want to talk about, in some senses, the masculine side of the equation today. And in honor of Jerry's brother, David, I addressed this topic. And on a personal level, I want to address this homily and dedicate this homily to Séamus, my own brother, who has been a source of extraordinary inspiration and support to me, and particularly during our adult lives. You've heard me speak about Séamus many times over the years, and normally I shared funny incidents from his childhood, because he was a real obstreperous little boy when he was very, very small, always into mischief. I was the good boy, never got in trouble, until I got into my 30s with politicians in Kenya, and my 50s with the church hierarchy in the United States. Before that, I was a really nice, quiet kid. So Séamus did it for the first part, and I'm doing it for the second part. So I remember one story, for instance, I may have shared it with you before. He's a small little kid, about 4 years of age, and he was always a really, really good musician. He could pick up any instrument and just play it naturally. And he's in town one day with my mother. We lived way outside the country. There was a bus that went into town maybe once a day. And my mother is in town shopping, and it's a holy day of obligation, if you still remember that. There are kind of weekdays in which you had to go to Mass, otherwise you risked winding up in hell. So you'd have to try to get your business done, go to your job or whatever, and then take time out to go to Mass. So she's downtown in Cork shopping, and Séamus is being really obstreperous. So finally she thinks, I'll keep him quiet, I'll buy him a little mouth organ. So she buys him this little plasticky mouth organ about this length, and he's dead happy. And she finishes with her shopping, and now it's getting on to 11 o'clock, and there's a Mass at St. Peter and Paul. There's a big, big church down in Cork City, and it'll be jam-packed, because people are coming out of their workstations to make sure they don't wind up in hell. They're getting an hour off to come to Mass. And my mother comes in the back door of the church and is absolutely jam-packed. And in this church, it's a much, much wider church than this one. Up in front here, the sanctuary area is a big marble floor. And the priest, of course, is right at the back with his face turned to everybody, minding his own business. And then there were choir stalls facing each other, where the monks used to chant Gregorian chant to each other. So there's 4 or 5 rows on this side and 4 or 5 rows on that side facing each other. And when the church was really, really packed, the latecomers would be dragged up and they'd be seated in these benches. So my mother is dragged up at about 2 minutes after 11. Mass is about to start. And she's put in the front row here. It's packed behind her. It's packed over there. And Séamus is sitting beside her. And it's a solemn mass. It may have been like December 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception or something. And they're up at the back is the huge big organ, and the official choir is up there. And they're going to sing the Missa de Angelis. And you know this, you remember this from the old days. The lead tenor will, first the guy hits the organ. There's a silence for a few seconds, and then the lead tenor says, Gloria in excelsis Deo. And then there's a small silence, and then the rest of the choir comes in and says, and it continues to respond to him. But there's this little gap in between. So the guy hits the organ, and the lead tenor goes, Gloria in excelsis Deo. There's a tiny silence, and Séamus pulls out his smoker and goes, and there's dead silence in the church. Everybody stops. The choir have no idea. Do we get a different lead? There's dead silence. So they look around the place. The priest has no idea what's happening. So the organ guy decides, I better start it again. And the tenor goes, Gloria in excelsis Deo. There's silence before they come in, and Séamus goes, So at this stage, my mother freaks out, and she slaps his hand. And the mouth organ falls on the floor, and it skids across the marble floor, landing right behind the priest. He's got his back turned. He's no idea what's happening. There's some kind of kalele happening there. Séamus picks up the mouth organ, sits on the ground, facing the crowd with his back to the priest, and makes sure that the mouth organ isn't broken. And then crawls back and sits beside my mother. So at this stage, my mother has her head in her hands. And she never takes her head out of her hands until the Mass is finished, the priest has gone, the choir has gone home, and the last person has left the church. And then, very shamefacedly, she makes her way out. So that was typical of Séamus as a kid. However, he got all the wildness out of him as a young man. He became a father. He's the father of 8 kids, and he's a real hands-on father. And now has 11 grandkids, and he's a real hands-on grandfather. But much more importantly than that, he's been an inspiration and a support to me in our adult years. Every time I would come back from Kenya, every 3 years I'd get 3 months vacation, I'd come back home and he'd have a car for me. He's a mechanic by trade. He'd have a car specially there for me. He'd fill it with gas and he'd give me a credit card. I never had a credit card in my life for the vacation. And he comes out to me every year and I give him a long list of stuff I need him to do. He's a genius with his hands, whether it's electrical work or plumbing or car mechanics or carpentry. You can do any of these things. So I presented with this long, long list that he accomplishes. And then during the last years of my father and mother's life, my father had dementia for the last 7 or 8 years, and my mother had chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder for the last 6 or 7 years of her life. Séamus was the go-to guy. He was the main pillar of the family supporting this. So this is to honor Séamus this morning. So I'm going to make 4 main points as I talk about brothers this morning. The first one, I'm going to trace brothers in the Bible. And secondly, I'm going to look at the evolution of the notion of brother or brotherhood. Thirdly, I'm going to call it patriarchy, matriarchy, and heteriarchy. And then finally, I'm going to talk about moving from gender to androgyny. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So I want to start by looking at what do we read about brothers in the Bible. And it does not get off to a very auspicious start. The very first story, in Genesis chapter 4 of brothers, is the story of, I see Tom nodding his head, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel over a dispute that was actually God's fault. Cain was a farmer and he grew crops, and Abel was a shepherd and he had sheep. And they both bring their gifts to God. Cain brings vegetables to God, and Abel brings a sheep, meat to him. Obviously, God was not a vegetarian at this stage. He rejected the veggies, and he accepted the meat offering. So Cain got really upset. Why are you accepting his offerings and you want to accept mine? And God told him, suck it up, dude. And so Cain got very upset and he killed his brother. So the very first episode of brothers in the Bible, we get off to a really, really bad start. The second episode isn't much better. After God, in one of his road rages, has wiped out everything, everything is wiped out in the flood, only 8 people survive. Noah and his wife, and their 3 sons, and the wives of the 3 sons. 8 people survive. And when the flood is done, Noah becomes the first vine dresser, the first person to grow grapes and to make wine. And he gets totally sloshed. And he's inside in his tent, and he's uncovered, completely naked. And one of his sons, a guy called Ham, sees him and comes out and starts giggling and starts telling the other two boys, Daddy's inside, and he starkers. So the other two guys, they get a blanket, and they back their way in, and they throw it over their daddy. And then when Daddy wakes up, they snitch on their little brother. And the father curses Ham. And he says, you're going to be a slave to your brother all the days of your life. And this then became an excuse for the enslavement of the Canaanites. The Canaanites are descended from Ham, and the Egyptians are descended from Ham. It's called the land of Ham. And it became an excuse, even in this country, the justification for the slavery of African Americans. They point to this phrase. So here, the second episode of Brothers ain't too good either. The third episode is the story of Abraham's two sons. So Abraham's wife, Sarah, was barren. She couldn't have children of her own. So at one stage, as was the custom, she took her slave girl, Hagar, an Egyptian slave girl, and she said to Abram, I want you to have a child with this, and that child will belong to me. That was a common arrangement in the Middle East, and even in Africa with the people that I lived in. And so she presents this woman, Hagar, to Abraham, and Abraham impregnates her. And once Hagar gets pregnant, she starts getting very, very uppity, and she starts getting snotty with Sarah. And Sarah's not one bit impressed, so Sarah starts physically abusing Hagar until finally Hagar runs away. But they persuade her to come back, and she's now back as the slave girl. She gives birth to a child, and his name is Ishmael, who becomes the father of the Arab nations eventually. But when he was 12 years old, Sarah miraculously got pregnant herself, and she gives birth to her son, Isaac. And after a few days, she noticed one day that the little 12-year-old Ishmael is really, really fond of his little baby brother. And he's playing with him and cooing with him, whatever. And Sarah got really, really upset. And she orders Abraham to send her away. I'm not going to share my inheritance, my son's inheritance, with this slave girl's child. And Abraham, being the wimp that he was, he gives Hagar and his 12-year-old son a loaf of bread and a bottle of water and sent them off to look after themselves. So there was the third episode of Brothers. A brother who loved his little brother, but never got a chance. So where Isaac becomes the father of the Jewish nation, Ishmael becomes the father of the Arab nations. Fast forward a few years, and now Isaac himself is married. He marries a woman called Rebekah. And Rebekah has twin sons born. The first one out is called Esau. And Esau is covered in hair, red hair, is a real hairy little infant. And the second one is smooth. So the first one is Esau, and the second one is Jacob. But as happens in many families, the daddy loved, Esau, because he grew up to be a real man, a real hunter. He was a great hunter. And Mama loved the other guy, because he was a stay-at-home little boy, who sat by the fire, and Mommy made him cookies and stuff like that. And so at one stage, Esau, now he's a grown man, comes back from the hunt, and he's really, really famished. And he sees that Jacob has just made this great soup, mess of pottage is called in the Bible. And he says, oh my God, I'm dying, give me a bowl of soup. And Jacob says, I will, on one condition. You give me your birthright. You are the firstborn, I give you this bowl of soup if you sell me your birthright. And Esau thinks, I'm dying of hunger. What's the point? What's the birthright if I'm dying of hunger? He says, okay, you can have it. So he gives him a bowl of soup, and he takes his birthright. Fast forward a few more years, and now Isaac is an old man, and he's dying, and he's completely blind. So he calls in Esau, the hunter's son, and he says, I want you to go out into the forest, and I want you to kill me a deer and cook me a really great meal, and then I'll give you my final blessing. Everything I have as a blessing, I will give to you. The mother is listening to this outside the door. Rebecca is listening. So as soon as Esau goes off on the hunt, she calls Jacob and says, I have a plan. Go and kill a calf. I'll prepare it for you, your dad's favorite meal. And you go in and you pretend that you're Esau and ask him for the blessing. And Jacob says, he'll know it's not me. All you have to do is touch my hands. She says, I have a plan. We're going to put kid skin. We're going to, when we skin the animal, we're going to put it on your arms here, and so your dad feels your arms, he thinks it's Esau. So they prepared the meal, and he comes in with the meal to his father, and he says, Dad, I have the meal for you. And the dad said, you found prey so quickly? And Jacob said, yeah, your God was with me, and I was really lucky in the chase. And the father says, there's something strange. The voice is the voice of Jacob. Come here, let me feel you, my son. So Jacob comes over and he catches his hand. He says, that's strange. He says, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau, and the smell is the smell of my son, the hunter. So he eats the meal, and he gives this blessing where he gives everything to Jacob. About an hour later, Esau comes in, prepares a meal, goes into his dad, says, Dad, I got some venison, I prepared a meal for you. And the father says, what do you mean? He said, you were here a few hours ago, I gave you my blessing. And Esau freaks out. He said, have you no blessing left for me, Dad? I haven't, son. I only have one blessing. You will serve your brother all the days of your life. He took your blessing. I can't take it back. So the mother at this stage realizes that Jacob is in danger. So she sends him off to her brother Laban, who's living in Mesopotamia. And he spends 20 years there, actually, and he gets 2 wives there. He marries Rachel, and her sister Leah. But after 20 years, he figures it's time to come back home, and he's wondering, will Esau ever let go of this? So he divides his flock into 2 groups, and he sends one group ahead, and he says, give these as a donation to my brother Esau. And Esau finally sees all these animals, says, who do these belong to? They're a gift from your brother. So he rushes ahead to meet his brother, and he falls all over him. Welcome, he says, I don't need this. I'm rich on my own. Right, I just so happy to see you back after all these years. He had totally let go of all the stuff. In my opinion, probably one of the most forgiving characters in all of the scriptures. He let go completely. He'd be denied his birthright and the blessing, and he was just very, very happy to have his brother back. This Jacob then becomes the father of the patriarchs, 12 sons and a daughter called Dinah. So he's got these 12 sons, the youngest of whom is Joseph. And you remember that story, I talked about it last Sunday in a homily, that Joseph was a dreamer, and he kept reporting having dreams in which his brothers bowed down to him, and even his parents bowed down to him. So the brothers were really fed up with him, and they sold him into slavery in Egypt. And they told the father he'd been killed by a wild animal. And so years and years pass, and there's a famine in the country, and the entire family has to go down to Egypt to get grain. And then suddenly Joseph reveals himself to them that he's their long-lost brother. And again, you have this extraordinary forgiveness, where Joseph totally forgives his family for having sold him into slavery and brings the whole family, 70 people, down and sustains them. So he forgives them and he saves them from the famine. So you can see that towards the end of that story in Genesis, that brotherhood is changing from this murderous, fratricidal relationship to a forgiveness and a salvation mode. You come right up to the New Testament then, and you find brothers very frequently mentioned in the New Testament. The very first disciple of Jesus, there's a story in John's Gospel where John the Baptist is preaching, and as he's preaching, he's got his own disciples. As he's preaching one day, he sees Jesus passing by. And he says, look, guys, that's the guy I've been telling you about. That's the Messiah who is to come. So the 2 that he's with at the moment, they go off and they follow Jesus. And he's walking along, and all of a sudden he sees these two guys following him. And he says to them, what do you want? And they're stuck for an answer. And one of them says, Rabbi, where do you live? He says, come and see. So they came and they spent the day with him. And one of those, the only one that's named, was Andrew. And Andrew goes home and he tells his brother Simon, we found the Messiah. And he drags Simon along and presents him to Jesus. And Jesus is great at making up nicknames. He does it constantly. So he says to Simon, I'm going to give you a new name. You're going to be called the Rock, Peter. So he's now called the Rock. So there's the first 2 brothers. The next 2 brothers to join the group are James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And again, Jesus gives them, a nickname. He calls them sons of thunder. Now, whether it was Zebedee was a thunderous character, or whether it was the 2 boys who were real obstreperers, he called them sons of thunder. And then you see in Mark's Gospel, we're told that Jesus himself had 4 brothers, and they're named in Mark's Gospel. And in actual fact, there are 2 James mentioned as his disciples. In the 12, there are 2 Jameses. One of them is James and John, I just mentioned, and the other is James, the brother of the Lord. And so, although the family initially had real problems at this carpenter become a rabbi and thought that he had flipped his lid and gone crazy and tried to drag him away and teach sense to him, finally they began to get behind him. And James's own brother actually took over the young Christian movement, When you read through the Acts of the Apostles, it wasn't Peter who was in charge of the early movement. Peter was in charge once it got to Rome. He became the head honcho in Rome. But in Jerusalem, where they were headquartered, it was not Peter who was in charge. It was James, the brother of the Lord. And he lived actually for 30 years after Jesus. He died in 61 Common Era. And there's a great story in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 15, the first council of the church. It was more like a community meeting than a council. It would be like what we do at COJ. It was in 49 AD, or CE, Common Era, to settle a question. At this stage, the Jesus movement had spread fairly significantly, and a lot of non-Jews were joining it. So there was some group called the Judaizers who were insisting that if you want to become a follower of Jesus and you are not born Jewish, you have to convert to Judaism and you've got to keep all 613 precepts of Torah, and if you're a male, you've got to be circumcised. And so there's this big dispute, and the first community meeting of the young movement, the first council of the church, is held in Jerusalem in 49 CE. And Paul is there, Barnabas is there, Peter is there, John is there, and they all give their opinions. And then there's this great statement here in Acts chapter 15 where James stands up. He said, we've heard Simon give his opinion, and we've heard Paul and Barnabas report on their missions, and we've heard John speak. Now, it is my decision. And then he makes what the decision is. We will not insist on them becoming Jews first or being circumcised. So the other guys give their opinions, including Peter. They give their opinions. James does not give an opinion. James gives a decision. James is the leader of the Jesus movement. James, the brother of Jesus, is the leader of the Jesus movement for 30 years after Jesus' brother has died. And then there's this very enigmatic story. You find it in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. Thomas was also one of Jesus' disciples. But the Gospel of Thomas starts off by saying, I, Thomas Didymus. Now, that's interesting. It's like tautology, because Thomas in Hebrew means a twin, and Didymus in Greek means a twin. So, I, twin. So there was a belief system that Thomas was a twin. Now, the question is, of whom was he a twin? Who was the other half of the twin? And there's an esoteric belief system that he was a twin of Jesus, that Jesus had a twin brother called Thomas, and that Thomas had the real inside story, the mystical dimension of Jesus. So when you read the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas and compare it with the canonical Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas is a real deep mystical understanding that every one of us in some senses is a Christ child. It's not belief in a particular person outside, but the recognition of the divinity within. And so, was he a twin of Jesus, or is this just a story? So there's, as you trace the notion of brother in the Bible, it shifts significantly from a fratricidal relationship to an understanding of twin souls. That's my first point. The second point then, I want to just look very, very briefly at the evolution of the notion of brother or brotherhood. So it starts off, when you think brother, you're thinking a male sibling. Somebody with the same father, same mother, or maybe sometimes same father, different mother, but they're either, siblings or half brothers. So firstly, brother has this sense of, a male sibling. Then it becomes extended, and you can call brother, you call your male cousins, you can call them brothers, particularly, first generation, you can call all those brothers, and this is true in many, many different cultures as well. You can call all your first cousins, male first cousins, brothers. Then it gets extended further to the notion of a compatriot, that anybody from the same tribe as yourself, any male of the same tribe is your brother, so you call him brother. Then it gets extended outside that, and I really believe that it's a trajectory that keeps expanding. It goes beyond that to the notion of the entire human species, that all human species are part of the brotherhood or the sisterhood of humanity. We use this phrase often, the brotherhood of man. It gets extended to all humanity. The Native Americans move it even further. They have a term that they call all my relations. And by all my relations, they don't mean my aunts and my uncles, my first cousins and grandparents. They mean nature. They mean the rocks, they mean the oak trees, they mean the animals. So we extend this notion of brother to the all living beings, all sentient beings on our planet. And I think the ultimate is that we recognize that this is true, that everything is brother, in the manifest cosmos, whether they're extraterrestrials, whether they're extra-dimensionals or whether they're angelic beings, that everything that emanates from God is brother and sister to the rest of us. So I see that a trajectory that hasn't been fully fulfilled. We're on the way towards the full realization of what brother actually means. In fact, the word brotherhood or sisterhood, they're just placeholders. They don't really describe what the reality is. The reality is it should be more like soulhood rather than brotherhood or sisterhood, because all souls are related since they're all bite-sized pieces of God. And I see that as the trajectory of spirituality or mysticism, a gradual growing into this extension of the notion of brother until it encompasses all sentient life forms anywhere. That's my second point. The third point then, I'm going to give this kind of difficult title. I'm going to call it patriarchy, matriarchy, or hatriarchy. In the course of human evolution, as a society, and I mean as a kind of a global society, we go through various phases. And it was appropriate, given our understanding way back, that patriarchy would be a stage in that evolution. Patriarchy is a stage where physical strength determines who's in control of the resources. And it was natural that that happened as we evolved out of the natural kingdom. It's very natural. It's come to an end. It's outlived its usefulness. But it becomes really, really important how it ends. And it's not quite ended, because anywhere you see money being poured into the military-industrial complex or into any kind of an oligarchy or a hegemony where control over the resources give people the right to make laws or govern the rest of us, you're still operating from an old patriarchal model where it's the strongest or the person with the resources that gets to control the rest of us. That has long since shot its bolt. But the way in which that evolves, is really, really important. It's been my experience as I study world history that any movement, any attempt to change, which is anger-driven, is going to lead to further chaos. It never solves problems. It leads to further problems. So any effort to move beyond patriarchy, if we think that the solution to patriarchy is to substitute matriarchy for patriarchy, a situation in which men are disempowered and women are in control, you're going to wind up with hatriarchy, just anger and the oscillation between these two. The movement into matriarchy is not the final stage of the process. It's a stage into the movement into a totally different kind of an understanding. And again and again and again, where you see change being orchestrated by a love-driven dynamic, then you see transformation. If it's driven by an anger-based dynamic, you see chaos. You're simply trading one tyranny for another tyranny. So it becomes really, really important the way in which we make this transition. Even really, really good causes, when they're driven by anger and violence, they delay the eventual outcome. And I'm just thinking right now as I say this, I look at what happened in our own country and in many countries. Almost inevitably, every country which has wrestled its independence violently from colonialist regimes has wound up with civil wars shortly afterwards or at some stage of their history. Because when you understand that the way to gain control or to take control away from a violent group is by violence, you realize that violence allows you to get control, and therefore violence will allow you to stay in control. So any dynamic that employs violence as a means to an end is going to create more violence or delay the eventual outcome. And I'm thinking of one glaring example. In the 1860s in our country, we attempted to end the slavery problem in our country in a violent manner. Now, it was a really, really, really important and worthwhile endeavor. But the way in which we did it meant that 650,000 Americans died in this process. And it didn't really accomplish what it set out to accomplish. 100 years later, in the 1960s, Martin Luther King had to try to go the rest of the journey and through non-violent means create equal rights for all American citizens. But 100 years after the movement to free the slaves, with the loss of 650,000 American lives, the African-American population still did not have equal rights, and in some places still don't. It's a movement that's taking time to evolve. So it becomes really, really important that as we move from patriarchy into the next stage of human evolution, we do not employ violent, anger-driven means to accomplish that end. There's a movement that I've been hearing about recently that's really, really upsetting to me. And I would hope it's a very, very fringe movement. I don't know how extensive it is. But it's a movement that is kind of, I would call it the demonization of the male. And if this gains traction in our country, and it's a sin to be a male in our country, I foresee two fatal outcomes. The first fatal outcome is that anybody who takes this seriously and begins trying to raise the next generation of boys, we're going to wind up with emasculated, over-feminized boys who are ashamed of the crime of being born male. That's the first fatal consequence. And the second one is there'll be a lot of young men who refuse to accept that. So they will over-masculinize themselves in order to make sure that they're not second-class citizens. So any attempt to make it a crime to be a male, is destined to create bedlam and chaos in our society. It becomes really, really important. You add to that the whole notion of reincarnation. And it's my contention that there's not a woman on planet Earth today who wasn't a male in a previous incarnation. There's not a man alive on planet Earth today who wasn't a female in a previous incarnation. And so whatever gender you're in right now, whatever spacesuit you're inhabiting right now, it doesn't make any sense to me that you would buy into and get identified with the anger and the oppression and the prejudices of that particular gender, because you've been on the other side and you've been equally prejudiced in the other position as well. If there's any point to incarnation, it's the invitation to realize that gender does not define us, that we accept these in order to transcend mere gender identity and realize that we're souls on safari on planet Earth. In fact, I would go so far as to make this statement, that anybody who is driven by anger or prejudice against another human being of the opposite gender, that is a very young soul. That is a very young soul who's forgotten that in a previous incarnation they were in exactly the other position, equally prejudiced against the gender that they now hold. I would say the same thing actually is true of any anger or prejudice against race, or colour, or social class, or creedal formulation. Any one of us who sits in a position where we're angry, really, really angry with somebody of another race, somebody of another social class, somebody of another colour, or somebody of another creedal belief system, that is a very young soul who still hasn't learned that these things do not define us. These are just part of the equipment of being human. I've said to you many times that time is made up. Time does not exist. Time is an artifact of our incarnational abilities, because we're born with these tiny little laptops we carry between our ears that can't grok the entire gestalt, and so it breaks it up into bite-sized pieces and processes them sequentially, thus giving rise to the notion of time. The same thing is true of gender. Gender does not exist. God does not have gender. The soul does not have gender. And so it's an artifact of our incarnation that we're born into spacesuits that have either a male or a female gender. So we have to work with that, but not identify with that. As Christ said, you're in the world, but you're not of the world. You're in a particular spacesuit, which is male or female, but that does not define you. So it becomes really, really important at this stage that we outgrow our identification with race, with colour, with class, with creed, or with gender. Which brings me to my final point. I'm going to call it from gender to androgyny. So, as I say, gender, God does not have gender. The soul does not have gender. We experience God as gendered beings. I'm in a male spacesuit or I'm in a female spacesuit. So I'm going to experience God in various ways. But there are different facets to this. So there's just different attributes. So we need to move beyond gender into androgyny. Androgyny is a Greek term, basically putting two words together. Andro meaning male and gyne as in gynecology, meaning the female. So androgyny is the combination of these kinds of virtues. So it is by loving across the genders that we accomplish the move beyond the genders. So if you take, for instance, a relationship, a good relationship is impossible if one party oppresses the personality of the other individual. You can't have a good relationship. If my way of being in a relationship is to squash your personality, I can't have a good relationship. It is by dancing with the differences between our two personalities that allows a meaningful, healthy relationship to develop. To use a different kind of an example, if you look at, for instance, languages or cultures, you can't achieve world peace by having one culture or one language dominate the entire globe and force its culture or force its language on everybody else and wipe out all other languages and all other cultures. Every language is not just about creating different sounds for the same objects in the physical universe. It is a mindset. Language creates mindset and perspective. And so every language and every culture gives us a different perspective on the miracle of life. The variety of life is expressed through the different cultures and the different languages. You can't create world harmony by squashing them all. To use a third kind of metaphor. You can't have physical health if, for instance, there's a dichotomy between the cells in your body and the organs on one hand, and then the entire organism, the body itself, that there's a dispute going on between them. You can't have health. If every cell in the body decides to go independent of the rest of the organism, we have a word for that. We call it cancer. If a particular organ in the body decides to create independence from the rest of the body, we have a word for that. It's a fatal disease, a system failure. We're going to die. On the other hand, if the organism itself squashes the cells and gives them no say, and squashes the organs, insists that all of the cells become neurons, brain cells, and insists that all of the organs, the liver or the kidney or the lungs, become a brain, then you don't have a body anymore. So it's this dance of all the parts that creates the beauty of incarnation. So we have to move beyond just identification with gender. It's a temporary marker in our journey back into God. So I love this notion in Taoism of the yin and the yang. I've said to you many times that I believe that all virtues are love in just a different environment. In one particular environment, love is going to look like courage. In a different environment, love is going to look like compassion. And so all virtues are basically just manifestations of love. But every manifestation has two aspects. It has a yin aspect and has a yang aspect. Now, yin does not mean female and yang does not mean male. They're available to every soul on safari on planet Earth. And so the yin-yang divide does not divide women from men. And it does not divide the good guys from the bad guys. It's a line that runs down through each one of us. Sometimes it's appropriate to love in a yin fashion, and sometimes it's appropriate to love in a yang fashion. You take a case of a house is on fire, and the mother has been out shopping, and she suddenly realizes, my God, my child is caught in the house. And this big, brawny fireman bursts in the door, knocks it down, is smothered in flames and smoke, and he goes in and he grabs the baby. He's expressing love in a yang form, in a male, courageous, strong fashion. Very appropriate. But when he gets the little baby, if he treats the baby as a water hose and he grabs it by the leg and just jags it along the floor after him, that's inappropriate. He needs to get out of a yang mode and get into the yin mode. He's going to cradle this baby next to his heart so he can hear his heartbeat. So in the one person, it has to be both the yin virtue, yin aspect of love and the yang aspect. You take any one of the virtues, and I guarantee you there's a yin version of that, and there's a yang version of that, and the trick is to find the balance between the two. And that's the journey. Because ultimately, even yin and yang are the penultimate stage of the journey. There's a place beyond that, beyond even yin and yang, and that's the realization that we're bite-sized pieces of God. Anytime we're faced with a social situation, or a political situation, or an economic situation which is less than perfect, if our reaction to that situation is driven by anger, it will lead to further chaos. If it is not driven by love and compassion and forgiveness, even for the enemy, whoever the enemy happens to be, there'll be more chaos economically, politically, in our world and in our time. There's not a single human being on planet Earth today who did not raise his or her hand and say to God, send me. I know it's a very, very difficult time to be on planet Earth. I volunteer. I want to go down there, and I want to love it in such a way that things will change organically and gradually so that nobody gets hurt and nobody gets vilified. Every single one of us said that to God. For many of us here, if life is a 4-lap race, many of us are on the last lap. Are we going to kind of waste the rest of this race? Are we going to waste the entire last lap being angry at whoever or whatever? Are we going to remember why we came and what we came to do, to the brotherhood/sisterhood of humanity, that we came here to bring Christ consciousness into our world in our time? We can't do that through anger. We can't do that through hatred. We can't do that through fear. We can only do that through love and compassion and forgiveness. It is time that we woke up already. So let's open it up. How long did I go on, Michael? Sorry. I got a mouth in me. I'm Irish.
It's
5 to. Aye. So it's going to be a short question as I pull it. Mea maxima culpa. Aye. Johanna.
I'm sorry, I don't have a question, but I have an observation that I think that the chaos, you're correct about the chaos and anger. In this country, I think it was a very subtle and unspoken about reaction to the fact that we had moved to the point where we had a black president. And the things that are happening now with the leadership in this country were a severe reaction to that. That's what I'm
not going to get into a political debate at all, Johanna.
Oh, no, I didn't.
I want to say this, that this is a problem which is multifaceted, and it didn't just happen overnight. This has been growing in our culture for a long period of time. It didn't just happen with recent elections. I don't want to be pointing fingers at any one individual. All of us are on planet Earth. All of us are contributing. We're creating a morphogenetic field. And if the morphogenetic feed we're feeding is based on anger against anybody, we're throwing kerosene on the fire. And this is not a fire that started in 2016. This is a fire that's been part of our culture and our world for eons. So I'm not going to be pointing fingers at any one person. I'm saying you volunteered to be here now. You are here now. How are you responding? Tom.
So just take us one step further. So you share love, and then at times you feel like you've been, in return, you get abused or used.
Yes.
So how do you stem that tide?
That's great question, Tom. So you try to act out of love and you feel the response is to abuse you. If the response to you acting in love were always a response to acting in love, that would be a business arrangement. This is not a business arrangement. This is learning to grow. And you grow mainly through overcoming difficulties, not by living in a paradise. We lived in a paradise. We volunteered to be on planet Earth. Earth is not a paradise. Planet Earth is the boot camp of the galaxy. We came down here because we knew specifically we were going to be tested. There's a way of developing love which can only happen in the face of rejection and oppression and prejudice. And you signed up for it, and I signed up for it. So if we want an easy ride, don't volunteer for incarnation anymore. Ingrid.
Coming from the 60s, activism, showing up, standing up, and speaking up is a big part of being part of the dialogue and the consensual reality. But is it just as important not to just say, forget it, this is just too hard, or no one's listening, and just create your own little worlds of beauty and peace and harmony? Is that enough to shift things?
It's not. And so I've said to you many times that love comes out in 4 different ways. And I use the Super Bowl as a kind of an illustration. There's the love of confirmation, where you say, attaboy, way to go, you're doing a great job. There's the love of compensation, where you make up for the shortcomings of somebody else, by helping out when they're unable to do what they've been designated to do. There's the love of complementarity, where you play part in a team, and as a team, you move the whole process forward. And the fourth form is a love as confrontation or challenge. It becomes really, really important to stand up to injustice of various kinds. But you have to stand up with love in your heart, not with anger in your voice. Angry thoughts, angry words, angry actions are going to just throw kerosene on the fire. Even when you confront, it has to come out of a place of love and compassion for the other. Not of judgment of them, not of condemnation of them, but out of real love. Of course there's a place. We have to get involved. where you get involved politically or socially or any way you want, as long as you're doing it with a heart filled with love that's forgiving all of the players on the other side, because they've got their perspective, which is as valid as mine. I have no guarantee that my perspective is the correct one. It's just my perspective. And so the ability to listen to the other viewpoint and create a synthesis so that we can move on together, that can only happen when we're listening to each other, and we can only listen if we love the other person. We'll take one final question, and we'll, Teresa.
So Sean, with that, you're saying basically we have to do a ton of personal work before we're ready to speak up.
Absolutely.
Because I'm just thinking of a personal situation where I don't know how far to go into.
I get the underlying question that you're asking, Teresa, is about doing personal work. You know, so the details, are important for you, but for the discussion of your question, what's important is the personal work versus societal change. That's a hugely important piece. And I've used this example with you before. During my 14 years in Kenya, I was involved quite a bit in community development, and particularly water production. I lived in a semi-desert area where water was a major, major concern. And so through contacts I had in Europe, I got funding for many, many different water projects, where we would take water for miles from a source and bring it into a village. But I remember they were mostly really, really successful. But there were two particular projects that went bad, and they became great teaching models for me. In one particular project, a 2-year project, we had piped water from a source into a village, and on the Sunday morning, after 2 years of work, the chief turned on the faucet in the village square, and nothing happened. And we traversed the line, and a warrior from another tribe who hadn't got a water project just traversed the entire just PVC piping with a spear and just jabbed his spear into the pipe, every 5 or 6 paces. So the water just spouting out. So another project, we did it very successfully. We got water to the village, turned it on, everybody started dancing, we started drinking water, and everybody, 2 or 3 days later, everybody was down with dysentery because it was coming from a polluted source. We didn't realize that. The water itself was polluted. And that became a great teaching for me, that the pipes represent the systems. If the systems are inadequate, the consumer gets nothing. Nothing is delivered to the consumer. But even if the system is good, and as people, by bad water, if the individuals within the system are not themselves clean, you're developing a product that's going to poison the consumer. So that for me that is the dance between the systems and the individual. A system which is staffed by people who are not committed to their own spirituality is a system that's going to deliver a poisoned result to the consumer. On the other hand, the best water in the world, people in the best system in the world, if the system is corrupted, they'll be ineffectual. So it's a dance between these two things. Overthrowing, getting rid of corrupt systems, but at the same time being sure that we're doing it from a loving heart so that finally we erect systems which are staffed by people who are themselves committed to love. So I'm going to leave it there, guys. I'm going to pardon my verbosity. So before we continue with our Eucharist, let's offer each other a sign of our peace.